Imagine being live on national television, and your guest slurs their words, knocks over their drink, or blurts out something completely off the rails. That's exactly what happened on The Tonight Show more times than Johnny Carson would have liked. While Johnny was known for his charm and wit, even he couldn't always save the show when alcohol took over. From awkward stumbles to outrageous confessions, some of these guests turned late-night comedy into late-night chaos. 1. Orson Welles. Orson Welles wasn't your average filmmaker. This was the creative mastermind who gave us Citizen Kane, one of cinema's greatest achievements. When he walked onto Carson's stage in 1975, everyone expected brilliant conversation and Hollywood insights. What they got was something completely different. Before the show even started, crew members noticed Welles had been enjoying wine backstage. Multiple bottles, according to staff whispers. When the cameras started rolling, it became obvious this wouldn't be a typical interview. Under the hot studio lights, Welles appeared flushed and sweaty, his voice booming across the set. Without waiting for Carson's first question, Welles dove headfirst into a rambling 14-minute speech about Shakespeare's lesser-known works. Carson sat there, microphone in hand, unable to get a word in edgewise. The legendary filmmaker jumped from Shakespeare to political commentary to passionate rants about how Hollywood had lost its artistic soul. The most remarkable moment came when Welles attempted to quote King Lear. Halfway through, he clearly forgot the actual lines. Without missing a beat, he simply invented new Shakespeare-sounding dialogue on the spot. The studio audience had no clue they were hearing pure improvisation. It sounded legitimate enough that only genuine Shakespeare scholars watching at home realized what was happening. Carson's expression throughout this performance told the whole story. His face showed equal parts amazement and quiet desperation. After nearly 15 minutes of non-stop monologue, Johnny finally managed to interrupt with a simple, "We need to take a break." Once the cameras stopped, Carson turned to his producer with a resigned sigh. Despite this chaotic appearance, Welles remained welcome on the show. 2. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed carved out a reputation as one of Britain's most talented and most unpredictable actors. His powerful performances in Oliver and Women in Love earned critical acclaim. His off-screen behavior, however, earned something else entirely: fear from television producers everywhere. In 1973, NBC planned to have Reed promote The Three Musketeers on Carson's show. Then the horror stories started arriving. The booking team heard about his previous television appearances abroad, and each tale was worse than the last. On a BBC program, Reed suddenly performed spontaneous gymnastics in the middle of his interview. On another show, he poured whiskey into a potted plant, declaring the drink too weak for his tastes. During an Australian interview, when the host asked about his drinking habits, Reed threatened to remove his pants. He actually started unbuttoning them before producers frantically cut to commercial. When Carson reviewed tapes of these incidents, he made an unprecedented decision: cancel the booking entirely. This almost never happened. Johnny had interviewed countless difficult personalities, but Reed crossed a line. The actor's response was predictably aggressive. He called American television too bloody timid and claimed Carson was afraid of a real man. Carson refused to take the bait. He simply told his staff they might reconsider when he can make it through one interview fully dressed. That opportunity never came. Reed's drinking continued, and so did his wild reputation. 3. Truman Capote. Truman Capote revolutionized American literature with In Cold Blood, bringing a novelist's craft to true crime reporting. When he appeared on The Tonight Show in 1980, audiences expected sophisticated wit and clever observations. Instead, they witnessed something deeply uncomfortable. Capote's journey from backstage curtain to guest chair became treacherous. He stumbled slightly, catching himself before sitting down. Carson greeted him warmly, as always. "It's wonderful to have you with us tonight." Capote's response came out as something between a mumble and a groan. Nervous laughter rippled through the audience. Carson leaned closer, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Things deteriorated from there. Capote attempted discussing his latest project, but instead launched into an endless, meandering story about actor Montgomery Clift that went absolutely nowhere. You could see Carson's hope fading with each passing moment. Then came the moment that shocked everyone. Capote turned toward Ed McMahon and slurred, "You look so comfortable over there. Mind if I sit in your lap?" The audience gasped and laughed simultaneously. McMahon's face showed pure terror behind his frozen smile. Around the 12-minute mark, Capote reached for his water glass and completely missed, spilling water down his shirt. He continued talking as if nothing had happened, a growing wet spot spreading across his chest. Carson, ever the professional, called for an early commercial break. Capote never returned to the show. The appearance became infamous, not just for the awkwardness, but for what it revealed about fame's dark side. 4. Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby built an empire as America's favorite dad through The Cosby Show, earning multiple Emmy Awards and becoming one of television's most successful performers. His comedy albums broke records, and his stand-up routines influenced generations of comedians. He seemed to embody wholesome family entertainment. Behind the scenes, stories circulated about different behavior. One particular incident at NBC Studios became legendary among staff members. According to multiple reports, Cosby once showed up at the studio hours before his scheduled appearance, already in an altered state. He reportedly stormed through the building, making demands and causing confusion among crew members who weren't expecting him yet. Staff scrambled to figure out what was happening while trying to keep him comfortable and contained until showtime. Looking back now, given everything that has since been revealed about Cosby's dark history, these earlier warning signs take on new significance. His public persona of respectability masked troubling behavior that eventually led to his downfall and conviction. It's shocking to think that someone who presented himself as a moral authority and family role model engaged in such erratic conduct, even before his far more serious crimes came to light. 5. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters earned 2 Academy Awards for her powerful dramatic performances in The Diary of Anne Frank and A Patch of Blue. She was genuinely talented. She was also absolutely unpredictable, especially after a few drinks. NBC producers dreaded seeing her name on the schedule. They developed a specific strategy: book her second or third in the lineup, hoping she might sober up slightly while waiting backstage. This plan rarely worked. Her most memorable appearance happened in 1974, when she was promoting her autobiography. Within seconds of walking on stage, Winters interrupted Carson mid-sentence with a completely unrelated story about Marlon Brando. The show descended into beautiful chaos. She talked over Carson repeatedly, shouted directly to the audience, and at one point grabbed his cue cards and tossed them into the air like confetti. Carson tried maintaining control, but his polite smile began twitching like a man approaching his breaking point. The real casualty that night was a young actor sharing the couch. Winters repeatedly interrupted his attempts to speak, rested her hand on his knee, and announced to millions of viewers, "His movie isn't very good, but he is quite pretty to look at." The audience roared with laughter. Carson looked ready to disappear into thin air. Winters didn't appear on the show for nearly 3 years. When she finally returned, strict rules were implemented: early afternoon taping, limited champagne access, and a clear warning that one more meltdown meant permanent banishment. 6. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor revolutionized stand-up comedy with his raw honesty and fearless examination of race, relationships, and personal struggles. His groundbreaking comedy albums and film performances influenced countless entertainers. Behind the genius, however, Pryor battled serious addiction and mental health challenges. His struggles with substance abuse were well documented and often visible during public appearances. When Pryor appeared on The Tonight Show during particularly difficult periods, his behavior sometimes reflected these inner battles. He would shift between brilliant insights and concerning moments of confusion or agitation. Pryor's mental health struggles compounded his addiction issues. He dealt with depression and emotional instability throughout his career, challenges that made his public appearances unpredictable. Some nights he would be the sharpest, funniest person in the room. Other nights, something seemed clearly wrong. Carson handled these situations with remarkable grace, trying to support Pryor while keeping the show running smoothly. He recognized he was dealing with someone genuinely suffering, not just behaving badly. The comedy world knew Pryor's demons were real, and his battles were part of what fueled his honest, painful, brilliant comedy. 7. Dean Martin. Dean Martin built his entire career around being Hollywood's charming drunk. The perpetual cocktail in hand, the smooth voice, the effortless cool, it was his signature. Industry insiders insisted it was mostly performance. The alcohol was often just apple juice. The slurred speech was deliberate, and Dean was always in complete control. Until one night in 1976 when he absolutely wasn't. Martin walked out for what should have been another easy, breezy interview. Instead, he completely missed the guest chair and nearly fell. The audience laughed, assuming it was part of his act. Carson's smile, however, vanished quickly. When Johnny asked about Martin's upcoming NBC special, Dean looked genuinely confused. What special? Carson attempted to play it off with humor. Well, if you don't know about it, I guess I won't spoil the surprise. The audience chuckled uncomfortably, but Martin didn't smile. He just looked around and asked, "What time is it right now?" The next 7 minutes felt endless. Martin drifted between incomplete stories, suddenly burst into singing "Everybody Loves Somebody" mid-sentence, and eventually asked whether the show was live or taped, halfway through the actual interview. 8. Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr defined television integrity as Perry Mason for millions of viewers. Calm, composed, morally unshakable. That was his image. His 1970 Tonight Show appearance shattered that perception completely. Burr arrived 40 minutes late, stumbling backstage with disheveled hair and smelling strongly of alcohol. Carson's team wanted to cancel immediately, but sending away such a famous actor would create massive problems. They decided to risk it. The moment Burr walked on stage, everyone knew this was a mistake. His tie hung crooked, his hair was messy, and his eyes looked glassy and unfocused. When Carson asked what projects he was working on, Burr launched into a 10-minute monologue about orchids. Not a brief mention, a full 10 minutes discussing his greenhouse in Fiji. Carson repeatedly tried redirecting the conversation. Burr ignored every question, rambling about plant care and tropical climates, occasionally forgetting what point he was trying to make. The audience laughed nervously, sensing something was very wrong. As for Burr, he never received another invitation. 9. Zsa Zsa Gabor. Zsa Zsa Gabor embodied Hollywood excess fur coats, expensive jewelry, calling everyone darling. Her Tonight Show appearances usually delivered fun flirtation and shameless self-promotion. But in 1973, the alcohol arrived before she did. Gabor had already established herself as a Hollywood icon, known more for her personality and 9 marriages than for her acting career. She had appeared in films like Moulin Rouge and Touch of Evil, but her real talent was being Zsa Zsa Gabor, a skill that required no script and plenty of champagne. From the moment she appeared, wobbling in stiletto heels, something was clearly off. Carson stood to help her, always the gentleman. Zsa Zsa missed his cheek entirely, planting a lipstick mark somewhere near his ear. The audience roared with laughter, thinking this was all part of her usual theatrical entrance. Her accent that night was so exaggerated it practically needed subtitles. Carson asked simple questions. She responded with long, winding stories that ended nowhere in particular. She talked about her diamonds, her husbands, her dogs, and somehow connected all 3 topics in ways that made absolutely no sense. Then she started sliding closer and closer to him on the couch, invading his personal space with each passing minute. Ed McMahon, sitting safely at his desk, couldn't stop laughing. He was wiping tears from his eyes while Carson struggled to maintain any semblance of control over the interview. The band leader looked equally amused, barely able to hold his composure. Trying to salvage the segment, Carson held up a book about Zsa Zsa's famous sisters, Magda and Ava. Instead of responding to his question about the book, she raised her diamond bracelet toward the camera, turning her wrist so the stones caught the light. "Look at this, darlings. Worth more than all the NBC executives combined." She then launched into a 5-minute story about which husband had given her which piece of jewelry, getting the names mixed up multiple times. From that day forward, producers created what they called the Zsa Zsa Protocol, scheduling all her future appearances earlier in the day to reduce the chances of another liquid lunch. They also assigned a production assistant to keep a subtle eye on her backstage, monitoring exactly what she was drinking and how much. When she did return to the show, these precautions mostly worked, though Zsa Zsa always kept everyone slightly nervous. You never quite knew which version of her would walk through that curtain. 10. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole starred in Lawrence of Arabia and earned 7 Oscar nominations throughout his career, though he famously never won. He was equally famous for his extraordinary talent and his legendary drinking. Stories about his alcohol consumption were the stuff of Hollywood legend. He once claimed he'd been drunk for the entire filming of a movie and couldn't remember making it. He called his pre-show routine a proper lunch, which apparently meant consuming as much scotch as physically possible. O'Toole belonged to a generation of British actors who treated drinking like an Olympic sport. Along with Richard Burton and Richard Harris, he formed a trio known for their talent and their epic alcohol tolerance. In 1978, he arrived to promote the controversial film Caligula. Producers were nervous but hopeful. He seemed composed backstage, chatting amiably with staff members and telling charming stories about his theater days. That illusion lasted approximately 30 seconds after he walked on stage. Before Carson could ask a single question, O'Toole launched into a passionate rant about the studio lighting, claiming it was designed by someone who genuinely hates human skin. He squinted dramatically into the lights, shielding his eyes like he was staring into the sun. Johnny laughed it off, trying to steer him toward the movie. Instead, O'Toole delivered a 7-minute lecture on why modern actors lack proper discipline, training, and respect for the craft. He compared contemporary performers unfavorably to the great stage actors of his youth. He talked about voice training, physical preparation, and the importance of classical theater education. It was perfectly articulate, impressively detailed, and completely unrelated to anything Carson was trying to discuss. The audience sat mesmerized, not quite sure what they were witnessing but unable to look away. Carson kept trying to interject, to guide the conversation back toward Caligula or anything O'Toole was actually there to promote. Each attempt failed spectacularly. O'Toole was on a roll, and nothing was going to stop him. Then came one of The Tonight Show's most unexpected moments ever. O'Toole suddenly jumped from his chair with surprising agility for someone who had clearly been drinking, grabbed Carson's pen from the desk and declared, "Stand up, Johnny. I shall teach you the noble art of fencing." Carson, caught completely off guard, gamely stood up. He had learned over the years that sometimes you just had to roll with whatever was happening. O'Toole began demonstrating thrusts, parries, and lunges with Shakespearean flair and enthusiastic energy, using Carson's pen as a makeshift sword. He quoted lines from various plays while demonstrating each move, his voice booming across the studio. By the time they sat back down, Carson gently guiding O'Toole back to his seat, the actor had completely forgotten to mention his movie. The film Caligula, the entire reason for his appearance, had not been discussed even once. Instead, he seamlessly transitioned into recounting a 3-day drinking binge in Dublin involving actor Richard Harris and somehow a racehorse. Carson didn't even try interrupting anymore. He had surrendered completely to the chaos. He simply leaned back in his chair, smiled, and let the chaos unfold naturally. What made O'Toole different from the other guests on this list was the quality of his rambling. Even thoroughly intoxicated, his vocabulary remained impressive, his stories entertaining, and his presence magnetic. He wasn't sloppy or incoherent. He was simply unstoppable and completely unconcerned with the normal rules of television interviews. The production team backstage was in crisis mode, trying to figure out how to cut to commercial, whether to extend the segment, and what to do about the fact that the movie hadn't been mentioned. Carson's producer was frantically signaling, but Johnny waved him off. He recognized that what was happening was actually better television than any normal interview would have been. Unlike others on this list, O'Toole remained a welcome guest for years after this appearance. Producers knew what they were getting into, and they accepted the risk. Even in his most intoxicated state, he brought undeniable charisma, energy, and that irresistible sense that absolutely anything could happen next. He represented old-school Hollywood at its most charming and most dangerous. These stories remind us that even the biggest stars are human, complete with flaws and struggles. Some battled addiction, others simply had one too many before showtime. Through it all, Carson handled each situation with remarkable professionalism, grace, and that signature wit that made him a legend. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't done that already. See you in the next one.